Section 3.3, Types of Statements, Video 5. The last part of the section is called Variations of the Conditional, meaning that if you have an if-then statement, there are things you can do to turn it into another if-then statement. The three variations of the conditional are called the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. There's a new word. The definitions are pretty straightforward. For the converse of a conditional, you just switch the antecedent and the consequent. Remember, the antecedent is the first part of a conditional. The consequent is the second part. So the converse of P pointing to Q is Q pointing to P. If I have money, then I will buy a car. If I have a car, then, if I buy a car, then I had money. Are those equivalent? We'll talk about that in a moment. For the inverse, you don't switch the antecedent and consequent, you negate them. So the inverse of P pointing to Q is, you don't switch, you negate. Negation P pointing to negation Q. If I have money, then I will buy a car. If I don't have money, then I won't buy a car. Contrapositive. You do both, switch and negate. Now before we get to contrapositive, I want to go back to converse and inverse for a second. It's pretty easy to get these mixed up. I know one of them you switch, I know one of them you negate. And I've always asked students if they could come up with a gimmick for remembering one or both of them. And about a year and a half ago, somebody finally gave me a gimmick that was so obvious, I couldn't believe I never saw it before. The one that you negate starts with the letter N, sort of. Inverse negate. Inverse negate. It's the only gimmick that I've found so far for connecting inverse to negate and converse to switch. If you can come up with another one, I'd love to hear it. But let's get back to contrapositive, where you do both. You switch and negate. So the contrapositive of P pointing to Q is switch them and negate them. Negation Q pointing to negation P. Let's use the money car example again. If I have money, then I will buy a car. If I don't have a car, then I didn't have money. Now, why are we bringing up all these variations of the conditional? The answer is there's a misconception that when you have an if-then statement, you can just negate both halves or switch both halves or do both, and you have the same statement as before. But the truth is, you don't. In fact, of the four statements up here, the original, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, they are not all equivalent, but they do occur in equivalent pairs. So which pairs are equivalent? Well, we could build a truth table for each one and see which ones have matching last columns, but I'll spare you the details. A conditional is equivalent to its contrapositive. And it's worth stating, not its converse or inverse. That blows some people's minds. If I had money, then I will buy a car. If I bought a car, then I had money. No, maybe I want it. I can't just switch them and get the same conditional, nor can I take the inverse. If I say if I have money, then I will buy a car, you can't say anything about what happens if I don't have money. I didn't tell you what I would do if I didn't have money. I only told you what I would do if I did have money. In other words, you can't just take the negations and get the same as the original. So a conditional is equivalent to its contrapositive and its contrapositive only. But I did mention there were two pairs of equivalencies here. One is a conditional and its contrapositive. The other two are equivalent. But the converse and inverse are equivalent. And it's actually pretty easy to explain. If you assume or accept that a statement and its contrapositive are equivalent, because what does a contrapositive do? It switches and it negates. So what that basically means is if you have a conditional, switch the two parts and negate them both, you still have an equivalent statement. Well, take a look at this. If I take this statement's contrapositive, I would both switch and negate and it would turn into this. Actually, the converse and inverse are contrapositives of each other. That's what makes them equivalent. We're going to take a look at an example where you're actually asked to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of a conditional.